Deputy Clare Daly, 8.5 minutes remaining in the slot.
Thanks, Cian Corla. I think obviously you'd struggle to find anybody who would say that they're in favour of prostitution. Clearly it is something that I wouldn't like to envisage for myself or my daughter or any member of my family or anybody that I know. And clearly there is absolutely no dispute whatsoever that prostitution is synonymous with exploitation. It is linked in inevitably with brutality and in many instances with violence. And I'm not going to repeat some of the examples that were given of the horrendous experience by women and men who are trafficked for sexual purposes. I actually don't believe that anybody in this House is in favour of that type of activity continuing or being endorsed. But the idea that by raising issues about this bill and that by not supporting it, that somehow you're in favour of this type of exploitation, as suggested by the frenzied contribution of Deputy McGrath, I think is incredibly unhelpful in terms of advancing the type of debate we need on what are complex issues and need to be teased out as to what is the best way of dealing with exploitation. Now, that said, I find it a bit rich of the government to be waffling on about concern for women and concern for exploitation in areas of sexual activity, when our government was involved recently in the Manwin, the biggest porn company in Europe, merging and purchasing RK Net Media, and our very own Minister Bruton failed to use powers in his control under the Competition Authority to stop that merger in order to facilitate this, the biggest porn company in Europe, operating and trading out of the IFSC. Now, I'm not sure whether they're making any films there. Maybe they're just benefiting from the tax haven the way everybody else is there as well. And of course, they were ably assisted by Arthur Cox in setting up there. So it's a bit rich to be talking out of two sides of your mouth. But that said, the area of sex trafficking and violence against women are reprehensible and are criminal. There is already legislation dealing with both these activities on the statute books. The issue is that the Gardaí are not able to deal with it and haven't successfully dealt with that. So I think it's important to say this bill actually doesn't deal with sex trafficking and violence against women. It's simply based on the premise that if you criminalise people who purchase sexual services and make it an offence, then the demand will fall off and the problem will be solved. That's the basis of the proposition. And I think that's what we have to look at. We actually aren't talking about organised crime, sex trafficking or violence against women in this bill. We're saying if you restrict demand, you can restrict demand by criminalising the purchase of sex. And I actually don't believe that that's the case, or that there's evidence to support that claim. Now, before I look at the big picture, I just want to briefly touch on some of the details of the bill, because it's designed to be a deterrent and put people off from purchasing sex. But I think there's some very dodgy bits in that. I mean, firstly, on the one hand, I think 4 weeks jail sentence isn't realistic. We're moving away from short-term prison sentences. It's not something that is to be encouraged, and I don't think it fits in with overall policies. I have a real problem with the idea of a fixed payment notice, for obvious reasons, given the recent controversy over the power of guards in issuing fixed charge notices in relation to speeding offences and the allegations of those charges being written off because of political interference or whatever. But the reality is that this Act is saying that if a guard has reasonable grounds to believe that somebody purchased a sexual favour, he can slap a fixed charge notice on the person, and the person can either pay €500 or go to court to clear their name. Now, who's going to go to court to clear your name when you're putting yourself in the spotlight? And it gives guards enormous powers in the context of questions that have been raised about the accountability of An Garda Síochána. I'd have grave concerns about that provision. But I don't want to dwell maybe on the specifics. I think it is appropriate to dwell, as other deputies did, on the overall issue of how we as a society best deal with exploitation and prostitution. And those who support the method put forward by Deputy Pringle say this is what has worked in Sweden, therefore it is the only and best way to deal with that. Now, I don't agree with that for the reasons articulated by other deputies. There is actually no evidence to support that view. It has been revealed that there are substantial problems with the quality of the evidence produced there. The Swedish government itself has admitted that it had no statistics to begin with. Therefore, to claim that the activity had been halved, you can't if you don't know where you started off from. I think Sweden itself is incredibly different than Ireland. It's a country with a wealth of social supports, healthcare, welfare, education, gender equality, and that as well. And there is a lot of talk about concentrating resources on the exit programs to allow women to leave prostitution and so on. That's not actually included in our bill either. But I just think that the debate is very much pitched in a men versus women context, where obviously prostitution involves the exploitation of many men as well. And I don't believe the assertion that that this idea that you know, it won't be driven underground, because for prostitution to survive, the client has to be able to find the prostitute. Therefore, if the client can find them, so can the police. So if the client thinks he's going to be criminalised, he's not going to go because the police will catch him. That just doesn't stand up to any logic whatsoever. The conclusion is then, well, people won't bother going to but the same situation applies with regards to the criminalisation of drugs. Clearly, people who, you know, if you want to sell drugs, people have to be able to find you. It is criminal, but people can still find and purchase drugs. So criminalising the activity does not stop it taking place, and all evidence backs that view. My own looking on this situation is very much looking at the bigger picture, and I do think a huge part of the area of prostitution is linked to the economic position of women in society and exploitation in that regard. I have a similar view in some ways actually with George Bernard Shaw, the great socialist and writer whose play Mrs. Warren's Profession is on display in Dublin at the moment, is actually about a prostitute. And that play was written in 1894 to draw attention to the truth that prostitution is caused not by female depravity and male promiscuity, but simply by underpaying, undervaluing and overworking women so shamefully that the poorest of them are forced to resort to prostitution to keep body and soul together. That's what George Bernard Shaw said when he wrote the play. He had a wish to improve the position of women in society. He wrote about sexual oppression of married women. He wrote about being in favour of unmarried women to have sexual experiences and to have children, and support for them to go to work and so on. And I do think we have to look at this holistically. We have to look at the circumstances that drive people into prostitution. And generally speaking, I don't think that most people would like to be a prostitute and would, if they had a viable alternative, would go with that alternative. And I accept that. And they are the conditions, because all labour is exploitation under capitalism, in my opinion. But I do think that there are examples when it isn't a non-voluntary activity. I do believe that. I know of people who maybe a couple of examples. Obviously, there was the recent film about sex surrogates, where women were paid to have sex with people who had disabilities. There are many instances where maybe people are grappling with their own sexuality, maybe men who are afraid to come out, who engage in a cooperative physical act for which they pay another male. There's no violence, there's no, you know, anything in that, and that's a way of them releasing a physical need in a cooperative basis for which the person gets paid for. I know of people who are in heterosexual marriages where the sexual activity has finished and the male party has gone to prostitutes because there's a physical need there, monies are paid, there's no violence, there's no degradation. So this is a complex issue involving interconnected social relationships, and I think we have to look at it in a much more holistic way than this bill is proposing. But I do think it's very good that we're discussing it. I want to discuss these issues. I think the industry should be regulated and controlled to reduce harm, but critically, people should be given the economic sovereignty so that they don't have to go down that road, and the police are adequately resourced to deal with the issue where it does occur.
Thank you,